What is now going on? Ukraine is saying there are 50,000 Russian troops that they are facing down in Kursk. As of November 12th, they've said that they eliminated over 1,000. That's the story these days, over 1,000 Russian troops being killed in this region. And there's also stories of 11,000 troops from the DPRK joining Russia in this fight in Kursk, and a lot of talk about a looming offensive by Russia, which seeks to eliminate Ukraine's presence. What's going on here and on the battlefield? How does it reflect the overall situation on the battlefield?
Well, quite a bit, actually. The Kursk incursion by Ukraine was, again, it was a political stunt. It was not done in a strategic context. They took thousands of their best men and their best equipment, and they overextended their logistics, which are already overstretched, into Russian territory, where they had no prepared defensive positions. They have no fortifications there, and they're spread out in a very sparsely populated part of Russia. If you look at where they are in Kursk, there's really nothing there. There's one small city, and beyond that, they're occupying like hamlets or whatever it's called there. These just a collection of like maybe 3 or 4 houses on either side of the road. And this is what Ukraine is spending some of its best manpower and equipment trying to cling to. Now, depending on who you listen to, 40% or more of the territory Ukraine initially was operating in, they have been pushed out of it. So Russian forces, when convenient, when possible, they will push the Ukrainians out. But I don't think that they're in any rush to push the Ukrainians out altogether. As long as Ukraine is invested in Kursk, in this sparsely populated area of Russia, it's maybe politically unpleasant for Russia, but strategically, it is great for Russia because they are overstretching the Ukrainians even further. These are thousands of Ukrainian troops, and again, some of the best equipment they have, that if it's not tied up in Kursk, it's going to go back to the line of contact where Russian forces are overwhelming Ukrainian troops at this moment. And I remember at the very beginning, many people were pointing out that this is going to leave Ukraine's line of contact under-defended, and it's going to allow Russia's advances, which were already accelerating at the time, to accelerate even faster. And that is exactly what has happened now. Regardless of who you listen to now, including Ukrainian and Western sources, they admit that this Kursk incursion has cost Ukraine along the actual line of contact from Zaporozhye through the Donbas region up to Kharkov. And so in that sense, it is impacting the strategic lay of this entire conflict because it is accelerating the collapse of Ukraine's forces. People have to remember this is a war of attrition. And so it matters how many troops and how much equipment you are losing versus the losses you're imposing on your enemy, plus your ability to regenerate that combat power. And you can see in every single way, this conflict is working in Russia's favor in that sense and against Ukraine. And before the election, and we have been talking about this, you and I, Danny, for a while, Ukraine is in irreversible decline. They are deteriorating. This proxy war is going to be lost unless the collective West intervenes directly, and not to fight and defeat the Russians, but to at least freeze the conflict and maintain a Western occupied buffer zone in whatever is left of Ukraine, kind of like what the US did in Syria. So this was already a process in the making. People campaigning on ending the conflict in Ukraine is already ending, and you know who was ending it? It was Russia. Russia is ending it. So what the US and its European proxies are doing now is they're trying to manage what is left of this proxy war. And when you think about the whole purpose of this was to overextend Russia. There are policy papers literally titled Extending Russia, talking about precipitating a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, knowing that inevitably it's going to end in Ukraine collapsing, being destroyed, losing disproportionate numbers of soldiers and their economy being destroyed and just being left devastated as a nation state. But they have reached the maximum point of extending Russia to its fullest extent, where now they have to start winding it down because they have resources tied up there that they need for their other campaigns around the globe. And we have to always step back and look at the bigger picture. Ukraine is taking place within a much larger U.S. geopolitical objective, which is to maintain primacy over the entire globe. Ukraine is a means of controlling Europe and ultimately Russia, which spans Europe and across Asia, Eurasia. The U.S. is also committed to holding the Middle East, which is why we have this conflict with Israel, backed by the U.S., against Iran. It's almost an identical type of as a proxy war. And we have talked about many times before the tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, and the U.S. proxies a choice here. I'm based in Asia, the island province of Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Australia. I guess we can add Australia in. So we have to keep all of that in mind as we see this conflict in Ukraine unfolding, the trajectory that it is taking, and the decisions and the statements that the West is making regarding it. We have to keep it in mind in this wider context of Western hegemony worldwide.
One thing I've noticed in places like Business Insider, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they say that there has been a gamble that Ukraine made and that a lot of the gains that they've made in Kursk are actually very elusive because of all the problems that it has caused Ukraine and lack of problems that we are seeing with Russia. But on the other hand, there are others of the Western mainstream media who are saying that Russia is losing 1,000 troops per day. I mean, even this DPRK story, Brian, is to send a message to readers and viewers that Russia is on the retreat, their military is in trouble. How do we make sense of this?
Well, I mean, just look at the entire conflict since February 2022. There's always been a section of the Western media, Western officials, Western analysts that have been making this argument that Russia will be out of missiles next month. And they've been saying this for now almost 3 years. And so this is a mantra that they have repeated to convince people to continue supporting what is inevitably going to be a failed proxy war. But the point always was not to necessarily defeat Russia through Ukraine. It was to weaken and undermine Russia as part of a wider strategy of encircling and containing Russia. And then again, as I've mentioned, this extension of American primacy around the globe. So they're going to continue saying that because they want to try to keep it going as long as possible. They want to try to exhaust Russia to the fullest extent they can through this proxy war. And so they're never going to admit defeat. And as long as there's the possibility of keeping this going without a complete collapse, I think they're going to try. And I think the prospect of any sort of peace or any sort of admission of defeat in Ukraine is wholly unlikely. It's going to be like the situation in Syria. The U.S. lost their proxy war in Syria, but instead of admitting it and withdrawing, they've maintained a troop presence there in eastern Syria to spite everybody and to do everything in their power to prevent the reconstruction and the moving on of Syria. So they're going to do this with Ukraine almost certainly.
You know, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, Brian, there is the reality on the ground that we haven't been able to cover much here. Could you give an update on what's actually happening on the front line? Because now there's a lot of attention on Kursk. There's a lot of attention on, well, are there Koreans fighting alongside Russians? But there hasn't been a lot of attention as to what's been going on the front lines. Part of this is because, of course, the United States has been pretty bogged down in West Asia and the Middle East. But at the same time, and a lot of attention has been shifted there. But also, I'm wondering if there are some perhaps developments that don't warrant a lot of attention because they don't spell very many good things for NATO and the United States.
Well, exactly right, Danny. If you look at even a pro-Ukrainian live map, which updates Russian or Ukrainian gains or the loss of territory and events that take place day to day, you're going to see that along the entire line of contact, the Russian forces are pushing forward. And there was a New York Times article very recently with a graph that showed gains, Western admitted Russian gains in Ukraine over what was previously Ukrainian territory. And you can see that it's exponentially increasing, week to week, month to month. And if you look at these maps, you will see Russian forces moving forward faster than they ever have at any point of this conflict, except perhaps the initial special military operation. When it was initiated, there was that deep push into Ukrainian territory by Russian forces. This is the quickest Russian forces have advanced since then. So that is significant. There were Western media reports about Kursk, which is a city, a built-up urban area west of Donetsk city. Russian forces have approached and are on the outskirts of Kursk. And if you look at the map, there's this huge salient stretching out to Kursk. And now it's starting to wrap around Kursk, and it's also taking over surrounding areas. And if you just, because a lot of these maps have a timeline feature where you can put it back to where it was January 1st, 2024, and you could see how much progress Russia has made over the last year. It's remarkable. And this is something that if you had been following the Western media and their reports, this would come as a huge shock to you. But if you were listening to objective analysis of this conflict in Ukraine, this was always inevitable. This was going to happen. The war of attrition was going to grind down. Russia never needed a big arrow offensive because they could grind down Ukrainian forces. And once it reached critical mass and a point of no return, it would just begin deteriorating, and Russia would be able to make these gains. And they would be able to make them in a safe, incremental way rather than hemorrhaging manpower and equipment like Ukraine did during its failed offensive in 2023, and even its successful offensives in 2022 in Kharkov and Kherson.
Yeah, and Russia has gotten a lot of criticism, even up until this day, around how it has been engaging in this war, especially after the Kursk debacle. But I wanted you to comment more on this war of attrition, because now we are seeing the fruits, it seems like, of this decision. We are seeing that this conflict is not going anywhere. Now there's fear of whether Donald Trump is going to just end this conflict. And I don't necessarily hold out much hope in the US political system in resolving this. I also see how developments on the ground may be pointing to the need now to actually acknowledge the defeat rather than simply just being defeated. What do you have to say about this?
Well, the factor of attrition plays into not only the conflict in Ukraine, but U.S. designs for primacy worldwide. People have to remember there is only one single foreign policy objective. Everything else stems from in Washington since the end of the Cold War and obviously before the Cold War, but all throughout the Cold War and ever since the Cold War, regardless of who is president, regardless of who is in Congress, and that is to eliminate all peer and near-peer competitors, to maintain control over this U.S.-led international order. So in order to do that, the U.S. needs to have huge military and economic power. If you are in a war of attrition and you have exhausted your stockpiles of weapons and ammunition in Ukraine, when you still have wars you need to fight in the Middle East, the Asia Pacific region, to impose and maintain or expand your primacy, that is a huge problem. So looking at the conflict in Ukraine, people have to remember what the U.S. is expending in Ukraine is different than the types of weapons and ammunition they will need, say, in the Middle East or in Asia Pacific against China. But there are some systems that are needed for all three. There's some kind of fireworks display going off in the background. I don't know if you can hear that, but
a little.
So
but it's okay.
Yeah, so wasting any more resources in Ukraine is going to cost the U.S. in the Middle East and in the Asia Pacific region. So this isn't an election and a president coming in changing the direction of U.S. foreign policy because they realized the Ukraine conflict was a mistake. It's because they are reorganizing their priorities. They have reached the full extent of which they can extend Russia and Ukraine. And now it's time to move on to the Middle East or West Asia and the Asia Pacific region. So one thing that this conflict in Ukraine has exposed is the limits of not just US, but the collective West's military industrial capacity. We've seen them basically run out of artillery shells. And now they're stuck, they're limited to supplying Ukraine with what they can produce monthly. They're doing the same thing with pretty much every other system that they provide Ukraine: anti-tank missiles, anti-air missile systems, whether it's man-portable systems like the Stinger or Patriot or NASAMS. They are out of everything. They are stuck supplying Ukraine from monthly production, which is not significant and will take years to expand to any point that comes even close to what Ukraine would actually require. And again, this is just one conflict of many the U.S. has to fight and maintain and win to achieve this primacy that they are pursuing and have been pursuing for decades. So keep that in mind when President-elect Donald Trump was campaigning and he was talking about ending the war in Ukraine. We've already been talking about how this conflict was coming to an end anyway. And so he's wrapping it up, not because he's an anti-war candidate, but because it needs to be wrapped up anyway. And they need to pivot to the Middle East and to Asia Pacific. And it's because of this element of attrition. The U.S. realizes if they initiate war with Iran or they initiate war with China and shock and awe and a quick collapse is not achieved, and it becomes a conflict of attrition, they will lose. They will lose. And so this is what is guiding a lot of what we see in terms of foreign policy. And again, regardless of which candidate, which political party we're listening to.
I think oftentimes in US politics, there's a lot of ideological considerations. The material reality in the conflict in Ukraine meant that whether it was going to be Trump or some other force that arose in the establishment, they were going to have to contend with the Ukraine conflict. And it just so happens it has been Donald Trump rhetorically talking about it. But at the same time, I think the most important factor here, Brian, and maybe you can elaborate on this, is that Russia is winning the conflict, and that everything that's going on just speaks to this reality. And it's a matter of, well, when is it going to actually lead to a major change in how the United States and its NATO vassals determine how they're going to make that shift that you're talking about?
It's important to remember that there is continuity of agenda with U.S. foreign policy, no matter who is president. A lot of people say this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, this is Biden's war, but it isn't. I mean, he's obviously invested in it. He's presided over it. He in no shape, form, or way has ever opposed it. But this has been in the making for decades. If you go all the way back to Bush Jr.'s administration, let's just start at the beginning of the 21st century. There were already attempts by the U.S. through the National Endowment for Democracy and adjacent organizations to overthrow the government of Ukraine, to install a client regime into power, militarize it, and turn it against Russia. It failed in 2004. They succeeded in 2003 in Georgia. They militarized Georgia, and in 2008, according to the EU's own investigation, provoked war with Russia, and they lost. It was a mini version, a preview of what the U.S. would then do in Ukraine successfully in 2014 under the Obama administration. They would successfully overthrow Ukraine, and then they immediately began militarizing Ukraine. It was during the Trump administration that all of this continued uninterrupted, but with the addition of the U.S. finally supplying weapons to Ukraine. This was almost certainly the red line that was crossed, that convinced Russia that the special military operation was necessary, that it was unavoidable. Now, the thing is, when you decide something like the special military operation is necessary, an unprecedented large-scale military operation into neighboring Ukraine, you don't do it overnight. It would take time to organize, prepare, and launch. And it was just a coincidence that it unfolded during the Biden administration. They often say, if Trump was president, it never would have happened. It most certainly would have happened. And it will continue during the Trump administration unless the US itself divests fully from it. So understanding that, and then seeing where this conflict is today, and then we can understand when we see Trump saying he's going to divest from Ukraine, and we hear the Western media say Trump's going to cut off Ukraine. But if you're actually paying attention to the headlines over this last whole year, maybe longer, and we have been talking about this, Danny, you and I, on our respective channels during our conversations together, the U.S. is already cutting Ukraine off because they physically don't have anything else to give Ukraine. So how can Trump cut something off that already has long since been exhausted? It's all rhetoric. It's all rhetoric to sell us to the American people, so at least half of the population is going to get behind this or that part of the agenda. So that is what we're seeing. And I can't blame people for wanting to hope that things will change, but they're not. They aren't. So this is continuity of agenda. Trump played his role equally during his first term in office, and he will do so again this term. He's already all but guaranteed that he will.